"She's just a name left behind on old paperwork," my father said in probate court. His voice steady, rehearsed. My stepmother nodded beside him. "An administrative error from years ago." I didn't react. I didn't look at them. I didn't even blink. Then the judge paused, lifted his eyes from the file, and asked my father's attorney a single question. "Counsel, do you truly not know who she is?" The pen in his hand froze mid-sentence. The courtroom went silent, and for the first time that morning, my father's face lost its color. I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people uncomfortable, especially people who expect fear tears or anger, especially people who believe they still control the narrative. The probate courtroom was smaller than most people imagine. No dramatic balconies, no polished marble columns, just wooden benches worn smooth by decades of family disputes, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, and a clock on the wall that ticked loud enough to remind everyone that time was moving forward whether they were ready or not. My father sat at the polished table to my left. He wore the same navy blazer he always chose for situations where he wanted to look reasonable and restrained. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice, didn't slam doors, didn't make scenes. He let paperwork. My stepmother sat beside him, her hands folded neatly over a leather folder that probably contained documents she had organized herself. She had that calm smile she reserved for professionals, bankers, lawyers, clergy, a smile that suggested cooperation, while quietly insisting on con. Across the aisle, my attorney sat with a yellow legal pad pen resting lightly between his fingers. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. We had already agreed on how this would begin. I sat straight in my chair, shoulders back, feet flat on the floor, not rigid, not defensive, just steady, the way you sit when you know you won't need to move quickly. The court clerk finished reading the case title, a dispute over estate amendments, a question of beneficiary standing, a challenge to my legal relationship to the deceased woman listed in the original family trust. My mother. My father's attorney stood first. He was competent, experienced, the kind of lawyer who didn't overplay his hand because he believed the law would already be on his side. "Your Honor." He began, "This matter concerns a revision to the family trust executed lawfully several years ago. The petitioner," he gestured briefly in my direction, not looking at me, "has been estranged from the household for a significant period of time. She does not participate in family affairs, nor did she maintain an ongoing relationship with the decedent prior to her passing." Estranged. That word always sounded cleaner than abandoned. My father leaned forward slightly, signaling he wished to speak. The judge allowed it. "She hasn't been part of this family for a long time," my father said calmly. "She left, made her own choices. We respected that. But what she's asking for now, it doesn't reflect reality." Then he said it, the line he must have rehearsed, the line he believed would end the conversation. "She's just a name left behind on old paperwork." There it was, clean, efficient, almost elegant in its cruelty. My stepmother didn't miss her cue. "It was simply an administrative error," she added gently, "something that was overlooked when the trust was updated. These things happen." I felt the air in the room shift, not dramatically, subtly, like pressure changing before a storm. I didn't move. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. The judge wrote something down. He flipped a page. He adjusted his glasses. Then he looked up. "Counsel," he said to my father's attorney, his tone even almost conversational. "Do you truly not know who she is?" It wasn't loud, it wasn't accusatory, it was precise. The attorney hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but in a courtroom fractions matter. Your Honor," he said carefully. The judge held his gaze. "Before we proceed, I want to be clear. Are you telling this court that you do not know who the petitioner is?" The attorney's pen hovered uselessly above his notepad. My stepmother's smile tightened. My father turned his head slightly too quickly to seem casual. I remained still. The judge glanced down at the file again. "We'll come back to that," he said. "For now, I'm ordering a full evidentiary review of the trust amendments, including the circumstances under which the petitioner's name was removed." He struck the gavel once. Not hard, just enough. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. People stood, papers shuffled, Conversation started in low, urgent murmurs. My father didn't speak to me as he passed. He didn't need to. He believed he had already said everything that mattered. He was wrong. I hadn't planned to be back in that building, not for this. When I was younger, I used to imagine confrontations like this ending in shouting or tears, someone breaking down, someone finally admitting fault. Reality, I learned, rarely works that way. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old coffee and floor cleaner. A vending machine hummed in the corner. Somewhere down the hall, another family was arguing in whispers over something equally important to them. My attorney finally looked at me. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. "I am." He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod in return. Good, because they just overplayed their hand. I knew that already. Estranged, administrative error, old paperwork. Those weren't legal arguments, they were narratives, and narratives collapse the moment facts are allowed into the room. I leaned back against the wall, crossing my arms loosely. My breathing stayed even, controlled. I had practiced this long before today in places far less forgiving than a courthouse. Across the hall, my stepmother spoke rapidly to the attorney, her voice low but sharp. My father stood slightly apart, arms folded, jaw tight. He looked irritated, not worried, annoyed that the script hadn't gone exactly as planned. That too would change. I wasn't there to argue about money. I wasn't there to demand apologies. I was there because a record had been altered, and records matter, especially to someone who has spent her life living by them. The truth was, my absence from the family had never been a mystery. It had simply been inconvenient. After my mother died, the house changed, slowly at first, then all at once. New rules, new expectations, new silences. My stepmother had been careful. She never said she was replacing anyone. She just reorganized. Photos disappeared. Stories were shortened. My mother's name came up less and less until it was mostly avoided altogether. I learned early that there were two options in that house: conform or leave quietly. So I left. Not in anger, not in rebellion. With purpose. What my father called estrangement had been in reality a decision to live somewhere that required accountability instead of obedience. Somewhere where your worth wasn't determined by how well you fit into someone else's version of the past. I didn't tell him that. I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. I simply went where explanations weren't necessary. Over the years, letters went unanswered. Calls became rare. Eventually, contact stopped altogether. And then after my mother's passing, the paperwork changed. I didn't find out right away. These things move quietly through offices and signatures and forms filed away in county records. No one calls you to say your name has been removed. You only find out when someone decides you shouldn't exist anymore. When the recess ended, we returned to the courtroom. The judge sat back down, hands folded, expression unreadable. "We'll proceed," he said. My attorney rose. "Your Honor," he said, "before the court accepts the characterization offered by opposing counsel, we request the opportunity to establish the petitioner's identity and standing on the record." The judge nodded once. "Proceed." My father's attorney started to object, then stopped. He glanced at his client. My stepmother shook her head almost imperceptibly. They had nothing to gain by stopping it. They still believed this was procedural, that whatever was about to be said wouldn't change the outcome. I watched them carefully, not with anger, with assessment. People reveal a great deal when they think they are safe. My attorney turned slightly toward me. "Ms. Walker," he said evenly, "would you please state your full name for the record?" I did. The sound of it, clear, unhesitating, seemed to echo longer than expected. "And your relationship to the decedent?" She was my mother. My father's jaw tightened. The judge looked down at the file again. "Ms. Walker," he said, "the court will need to review several documents before making a determination. This may take some time." "I understand, Your Honor." My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. The judge studied me for another second. Not unkindly, not suspiciously. Curiously. "Very well," he said. "We'll adjourn for today. Counsel will submit all requested materials by the end of the week." The gavel came down again. This time harder. As people filed out, my father stopped near me. For a moment I thought he might speak. Instead he nodded once, stiff, controlled, as if acknowledging a stranger. I returned the nod. The hallway swallowed them quickly. My attorney gathered his papers. That went exactly how I hoped, he said quietly. I exhaled slowly. This is just the beginning, I said. He gave a faint smile. I know. So did I. Because silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. And this case, this family was about to learn the difference. I didn't grow up dreaming about uniforms or ranks. I grew up learning when not to speak. In my father's house, silence wasn't peace, it was compliance. You learned quickly which questions made rooms colder, which memories shortened conversations. After my mother died, her name became one of those things. Not forbidden, just unnecessary. As if speaking, it served no practical purpose anymore. My stepmother never said she wanted me gone. She didn't need to. She reorganized the house the way she reorganized paperwork, methodically, politely, with a soft voice and firm hands. Drawers changed, photos disappeared. Traditions adjusted for simplicity. By the time I left, my absence felt like a correction. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten or accuse. I packed a single bag, left a note that said I'd call, and walked out before dawn. My father didn't stop me. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as if this were something that had always been inevitable. Later, he would call it my choice. He never called it what it really was, a refusal to be erased slowly. The place I went next didn't ask about my family history. It didn't care who my parents were or what had been left unsaid at dinner tables. It cared about whether I could listen, learn, and hold myself together when things became uncomfortable. The first weeks were a shock to the system. Early mornings, clear rules, consequences that were immediate and fair. No passive aggression, no quiet punishments. If you failed, you knew why. If you succeeded, it was recorded. I learned quickly that discipline wasn't about being hard. It was about being precise. I didn't excel because I was angry. I excelled because I paid attention. I learned patterns. I respected structure. I understood that systems, when honest, could be trusted. That was new to me. Letters home went unanswered. At first, I assumed timing was bad. Then I realized silence had simply been chosen again, this time on the other end. Holidays passed, birthdays, years. I stopped expecting anything back. What I gained instead was something my father never gave me, a sense of place that couldn't be revoked by someone else's discomfort. When my service ended, I didn't return home. There was nothing there that required my presence. The house had adjusted without me. The narrative had already been written. I stayed busy. I stayed accountable. I stayed invisible to the people who preferred it that way. And then my mother died. No one called me when she got sick. No one asked me to come home. I found out the way people often do now, late, indirectly, through a message that assumed someone else had already told me. The funeral was small, efficient, clean. My stepmother stood at the front, composed, receiving condolences like she'd rehearsed them. My father sat in the first row, hands folded, eyes forward. There was no empty seat saved for me. I watched from the back. No one looked surprised to see me. That more than anything told me how long I'd been written out. I didn't stay long. I paid my respects quietly and left without speaking. It wasn't cowardice. It was assessment. Grief clouds judgment. I had learned not to make decisions under pressure. I would wait. Months later, the paperwork surfaced. It wasn't dramatic. No letter stamped urgent. No confrontation. Just a notice forwarded to an old address, then redirected. A summary of trust amendments filed years earlier, clean, lawful on its face. My name was missing. Not crossed out, not challenged. Simply absent. There was a sentence explaining the change. Neutral language, no accusation, no justification. Administrative revision. I read it twice, then again. It didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It felt familiar. The same quiet removal, the same insistence that absence didn't require explanation. I closed the file and sat with it for a long time. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about something much older and more dangerous, the belief that you can erase a person if you do it neatly enough. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer. It was someone who understood records. We spoke briefly, professionally. "Can you get me a timeline?" I asked. "I can," they said, "but you may not like what you find." "I don't need to like it," I replied. "I need to understand it." What came back was exactly what I expected and worse. The amendments began shortly after my mother's health declined. Small changes at first, language shifts, adjustments that seemed reasonable in isolation. Over time, they accumulated into something final, a clean version of the family story. One without me, one without her. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send emails or make phone calls asking why. I didn't need explanations from people who believed paperwork was enough to settle moral questions. I started building a file of my own. When my attorney and I met for the first time, he asked me one question before anything else. What are you trying to accomplish? I thought about it carefully. I want the record corrected, I said. He raised an eyebrow. Not compensation. Not revenge, I replied. Accuracy. That changed the tone immediately. We didn't talk about emotional harm. We talked about timelines, about signatures, about who had standing to make which changes and when. We talked about intent. We talked about silence. He listened without interrupting, then nodded once. Good, he said, because this isn't a fight, it's an audit. In the weeks leading up to the next hearing, I kept my routine. Early mornings, physical training, quiet preparation. I reviewed documents the way I'd reviewed operational briefings in another life line by line, noting what was present and what was conspicuously absent. Patterns emerged. My stepmother appeared everywhere in the paperwork, as witness, as facilitator, as interpreter of intent. My father appeared less often than expected. That mattered. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't need to. Documents tell their own story if you let them. I noticed dates that coincided with moments my mother could no longer speak for herself. I noticed phrasing that suggested urgency where none had existed before. Most of all, I noticed how often the word family appeared without definition. Family in those documents was a concept, not a list. That was a mistake. The next hearing came quickly. My father looked more alert this time, more cautious. He had read something, understood something. My stepmother was still calm, still polished, but her hand stayed on her folder longer than necessary. I took my seat and waited. Opposing counsel repeated the same themes with slight adjustments: estrangement, absence, choice. When my attorney rose, he didn't argue. He asked questions. Who initiated the amendment? Who drafted the language? Who reviewed it with the decedent? Each answer narrowed the field. The judge listened closely. When the session ended, he leaned forward slightly. This court will need additional clarification regarding intent and representation, he said. Counsel will submit supplemental documentation. He paused. And the petitioner will remain recognized as a party of interest pending review. My father exhaled sharply. It wasn't a loss. But it wasn't a victory either. It was something worse. Uncertainty. That night I sat alone in my apartment, documents spread across the table. The city outside was quiet, late, uninterested in family drama. I thought about my mother, about the way she used to insist that names mattered, that records mattered, that being written down meant being remembered. She would have hated what they'd done. I closed the file and stacked the papers carefully. They believed this was about inheritance. They believed I would eventually argue, plead, or disappear again. They didn't understand what I had learned. That silence, when used correctly, forces others to fill the space. And when they do, they reveal everything. The night before the next filing deadline, my attorney called. We found something, he said. Something new. Something old, he replied, and very specific. I closed my eyes briefly. Will it matter? Yes, he said, but not the way they expect. I hung up and sat still for a long moment. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the turning point. It was the moment before momentum shifted. And I was ready. The night my attorney called, I didn't ask him to explain over the phone. I asked him to email the document and give me time. Silence, I had learned, works best when you let it. The file arrived at 11:42 p.m. A scanned copy of a handwritten letter, yellowed at the edges, folded once down the center. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, careful, slightly slanted, precise, without being stiff. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical. That, too, was her. She had written it years earlier, shortly after the original trust was finalized. A letter of intent. Not a will, not a codicil. A statement clear, direct about her wishes if she became unable to advocate for herself. It named me, not emotionally, legally, as her daughter, as someone whose place in the family record was not to be altered by convenience or discomfort. She had signed it, dated it, filed a copy with the same county office that held the trust. It had never been referenced in any amendment. I read it once, then again. I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. The quiet sense you get when something you suspected finally confirms itself. They hadn't just removed my name. They had worked around it. The next morning I went back to my routine. Physical training, coffee, a brief walk before the city woke up. I kept my phone on silent. When you prepare for something that matters, you don't rush. You tighten processes. You check assumptions. You leave nothing unexamined. My attorney and I met later that day in his office. No drama, no congratulations. "This doesn't win the case on its own," he said, tapping the file. "But it reframes it." How, I asked. "It shifts intent," he replied, "from oversight to avoidance." That was the word I'd been waiting for. Avoidance wasn't neutral, it was deliberate. We mapped out the next phase carefully, not emotionally, strategically. We didn't plan to introduce the letter immediately, not yet. Timing mattered. Pressure mattered. Instead, we focused on exposing inconsistencies. Small ones. The kind that accumulate quietly until the story collapses under its own weight. In the weeks that followed, my father's side became more active. Emails, motions, supplemental filings that clarified nothing while trying to appear thorough. Each document introduced new language, new explanations. None of them mentioned the letter. None of them addressed the gap between revision dates and my mother's declining health. None of them explained why changes had been routed through my stepmother's attorney rather than a neutral party. I didn't respond publicly. Privately, I kept building. I requested certified copies of everything. I tracked timestamps. I cross-referenced notaries and witnesses. I learned which offices moved quickly and which required patience. I treated it the way I treated complex operations, break it into pieces, then reassemble it in a way that tells the truth. People misunderstand silence. They think it's fear or indecision. They assume that if you aren't speaking, you aren't thinking. In my experience, silence is where thinking happens. By the time the third hearing was scheduled, the atmosphere had changed. The judge asked sharper questions. He interrupted counsel more frequently. He requested clarifications that hadn't been necessary before. My stepmother still smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes anymore. Her confidence depended on the assumption that everything important had already been said. My father spoke less. When he did, he chose his words carefully, as if afraid one sentence might undo the rest. They had begun to sense movement beneath the surface. They just didn't know where it would break through. One afternoon, as I was leaving my attorney's office, my father called. It was the first time he had reached out directly since the case began. I let it ring once, then I answered. "We don't need to do this," he said without preamble. "We can handle it privately." "Handle what I asked." He hesitated. The misunderstanding. I said nothing. "This has gotten more complicated than it needed to be," he continued. "People are asking questions." "They should," I replied. A pause, longer this time. "What do you want?" he asked. It was the wrong question. "I want the record to be accurate," I said. "That's all." He exhaled sharply. "You know that's not how these things work." "I do," I said calmly. "That's why we're in court." He didn't respond. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Your mother wouldn't have wanted this." I closed my eyes briefly. "You don't get to speak for her," I said. "You gave that up." The line went dead. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the letter beside me. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. This wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about forcing anyone to admit guilt. It was about control. They believed control came from shaping narratives quietly enough that no one noticed, from editing people out without ever saying their names. What they hadn't accounted for was discipline. I had learned to wait, to listen, to act only when the moment was right. And the moment was coming. At the next hearing, opposing counsel attempted to shift strategy. Instead of arguing estrangement, he focused on relevance. Even if the petitioner believes there were irregularities, he said there is no evidence to suggest malicious intent. The judge leaned back slightly. "Intent is rarely announced," he said. "It's inferred." My attorney stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we agree, and we believe the court is now in a position to evaluate that inference." He submitted a brief stack of documents, nothing dramatic, no grand reveal. Just facts, timelines, gaps, patterns. The judge studied them carefully. "We will reconvene for a final evidentiary session," he said. "At that time, the court expects full disclosure of any documents relevant to the decedent's intent." My stepmother's smile vanished entirely. Outside the courtroom, my attorney turned to me. "They're boxed in," he said. "They don't know it yet, but they are." I nodded. "They still think this is about money," I said. He smiled faintly. "They usually do." I walked out into the late afternoon sun, feeling the weight shift, not lift, just move. This wasn't victory. It was inevitability. They had removed my name because they believed names only mattered on paper. They were about to learn what happens when paper remembers better than people do. The final hearing was set for the following month. Until then, I waited. Not passively, not anxiously. With intention. Because silence when chosen deliberately isn't absence. It's preparation. And preparation done well leaves no room for escape. The final evidentiary hearing began without ceremony. No raised voices, no dramatic entrances, just the slow, deliberate rhythm of a courtroom preparing to decide what would stand on the record and what would be corrected. I took my seat the same way I had every time before. Straight-backed, still, present. The posture wasn't performance, it was habit. When you've spent years being trained to stay composed while others lose control, your body remembers even when your mind is elsewhere. My father sat 2 seats away from my stepmother. That distance was new, subtle but telling. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering with a sharp urgency she hadn't bothered to hide anymore. He nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the judge. The judge entered. The room stood. The room sat. "Counsel," he said, scanning the bench, "we're here to conclude this matter. I expect clarity today." No one objected. My father's attorney stood first. He spoke carefully now, less confident, less theatrical. "Your Honor," he said, "we maintain that the trust amendments were lawful and that any omissions were administrative in nature. There was no intent to misrepresent." The judge lifted a hand, not abruptly, precisely. "I've reviewed the filings," he said. "You may proceed, but understand this court is no longer concerned with how this appears on its face. We are concerned with what was known when it was known, and by whom." The attorney nodded, swallowed, and continued. He spoke about process, about delegation, about misunderstandings. He avoided names. When he finished, the judge turned to my attorney. "Your witness." My attorney stood. "We call Ms. Walker," he said. I rose. The walk to the stand felt familiar. Not because I'd done this before, but because I'd walked into rooms like this many times in my life, rooms where words carried consequences and posture mattered. I took the oath Saturday. My attorney began with the basics: name, age, relationship to the decedent. Then he paused. "Ms. Walker," he said evenly, "can you briefly describe your professional background?" There it was, the hinge. I didn't rush it. "I serve in the United States military," I said. "I have for over 2 decades. A few heads turned. My father didn't. "And your current position?" "I hold a senior officer rank," I replied, "with command responsibilities." The room changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but unmistakably. The judge leaned forward slightly. The clerk stopped typing for half a second. My stepmother's attorney glanced down at his notes, then back up as if recalibrating. My father finally turned toward me. I kept my eyes forward. My attorney didn't dwell on it. He didn't list commendations or deployments. He didn't need to. He simply established that my absence from family life hadn't been a drift into nothingness. It had been service. "Ms. Walker," he continued, "are you familiar with record-keeping standards?" "Yes," I said, extensively. "And the importance of accuracy?" "Yes." He nodded. "I'd like to introduce Exhibit C." The clerk took the document. The judge reviewed it. "Is this the letter you identified earlier?" my attorney asked. "It is," I said. "Can you explain its purpose?" "It's a letter of intent," I replied, "written by my mother, filed with the county. It outlines her wishes regarding her estate and my standing as her daughter should she become unable to advocate for herself." My father's attorney rose. "Objection," he said. "This document was not incorporated into the trust." "Sustained in part," the judge said calmly, but the court will hear testimony regarding its existence and relevance to intent. He turned back to me. Proceed. I explained how the letter had been written, when it had been filed, where it had been stored, how it had remained untouched through multiple trust revisions. I didn't speculate, I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. When my attorney finished, my father's counsel approached for cross-examination. He hesitated before speaking. Ms. Walker, he said, you've described a demanding career, one that requires distance, time away. Yes, I said. And during that time you had limited contact with your family. That's correct. So it would be fair to say that your relationship with the household was minimal. No, I said, it would be accurate to say it was one-sided. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge didn't react. The attorney shifted. You didn't attend family holidays. You weren't present for daily life. I was serving, I replied. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. He tried again. Isn't it possible that your mother intended to revise her estate in light of your absence? No, I said, because she didn't. How can you be sure? Because she wrote it down, I said calmly. Silence. The attorney nodded stiffly and returned to his seat. The judge looked at my father. Mr. Walker, he said, you may testify. My father stood slowly. He looked older than I remembered, smaller. He spoke about grief, about confusion, about trusting professionals. He avoided my name entirely. Then the judge asked him one question. When these amendments were made, he said, did you inform counsel of the existence of your late wife's letter of intent? My father hesitated. I don't recall, he said. The judge waited. That's not an answer, he said gently. My stepmother leaned forward. I handled most of the paperwork, she said quickly. My husband was dealing with a great deal at the time. The judge looked at her. Were you aware of the letter? She smiled thinly. I don't believe it was relevant. The judge nodded slowly. I see. He turned back to the file, flipped a page, then another. Let the record reflect, he said, that the court finds significant omissions in the disclosure of materials directly bearing on the decedent's intent. He looked up. And let the record further reflect that the petitioner's absence from the household does not constitute abandonment, nor does it negate her legal identity. My father's shoulders slumped. The judge continued. This court also recognizes the petitioner's service to this country as a matter of public record. He paused. Service that required sacrifice, not erasure. The words landed hard. My stepmother's hands trembled against the table. The judge closed the file. I am prepared to rule. The room held its breath. Ms. Walker, he said, this court recognizes you as the lawful daughter of the decedent with full standing under the original trust. My father closed his eyes. The amendments removing your name are hereby set aside pending corrective action. The estate will be restructured to reflect the decedent's documented intent. He struck the gavel once. This court does not erase people, it corrects records. That was it. No applause, no confrontation. Just truth spoken aloud where it could no longer be denied. As the room emptied, my father remained seated. My stepmother stood quickly gathering her things, eyes fixed straight ahead. I stepped down from the stand and walked past them. My father looked up. For a moment he seemed like he might speak. Then he didn't. And that was enough. Because some silences don't hide the truth. They confirm it. The courthouse emptied the way it always does, slowly, quietly, without ceremony. No one celebrates outside a probate court. There are no raised voices or dramatic exits, just people stepping back into their lives carrying documents instead of verdicts, decisions instead of closure. I stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the late afternoon air settle on my skin. It felt different now. Not lighter, just clearer, like a pressure system finally moved on. My attorney joined me, adjusting his coat. It's done, he said. Yes, I replied, it is. He studied me carefully, then smiled faintly. Most people walk out of here angry, or relieved. You look steady. I am, I said, and I meant it. He hesitated. There's one more thing we should discuss. I know, I said, the distribution. We walked a short distance to a bench beneath a leafless tree. He sat, I remained standing. The court restored your standing fully, he said. That gives you options. I'm aware. He waited. I could tell he was trying to read my next move. I don't want to undo everything, I said finally. just what was wrong. He nodded slowly. That's unusual. So am I said without arrogance, just fact. The final paperwork took weeks. That part never makes good stories. Signatures, verifications, quiet corrections made in offices that never ask why. The estate was restructured. My name restored where it had been removed. My mother's intentions honored in the language she had chosen. I accepted what was rightfully mine and no more. Some people expected anger, expected me to demand consequences beyond the ruling, expected me to scorch the earth now that I had the chance. But scorched earth leaves nothing to stand on. I had come back for accuracy, not destruction. My father called me 2 weeks later. I almost didn't answer. But leadership teaches you something early on. Closure doesn't always arrive on your terms. Sometimes it shows up quietly, and if you don't acknowledge it, it rots. I didn't realize how far things had gone, he said. It wasn't an apology, not really. I know, I replied. A pause. You didn't have to take it this far. I didn't, I said. I stopped it where it belonged. Another pause, longer this time. I should have protected the record, he said quietly. Yes, I said, you should have. We didn't talk about forgiveness. We didn't talk about rebuilding anything. Some things don't get rebuilt. They get stabilized. Before he hung up, he said one last thing. Your mother would be proud. I let that sit. I know, I said. And I did. A month later, I finalized the paperwork for the scholarship. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, just enough to matter. A small fund established in my mother's name for women pursuing public service law medicine emergency response. Fields where responsibility outweighed recognition. No press release, no ceremony. Just a record. I also directed a portion of the estate to a local veterans support program, the kind that helps quietly, housing assistance, job placement, counseling. People who understand that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. That felt right. On a quiet evening not long after I returned to my apartment and opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were a few things I'd kept from childhood, old photos, school papers, a bracelet my mother had given me when I was younger. At the bottom was a copy of the letter she'd written, the one that had nearly been erased. I read it once more. Not because I needed reassurance. Because it reminded me why I'd stayed disciplined when it would have been easier to explode. She had known even then that the greatest danger wasn't conflict. It was omission. People often misunderstand revenge. They think it has to be loud, punishing, final. But the most effective revenge doesn't destroy, it corrects. It doesn't shout. It documents. By the time this was over, no one could claim confusion. No one could pretend not to know. The record spoke for itself. And that was enough. I went back to my work. Back to command meetings. Back to responsibilities that didn't pause for family drama. No one there treated me differently. They never had. I carried myself the same way I always did, steady, precise, accountable. But something had changed. Not externally. Internally. I no longer carried the question of whether I belonged anywhere. The answer was written down. Sometimes late at night I think about that moment in the courtroom. The judge's voice, the pause, the weight of a single question. Do you truly not know who she is? It wasn't just addressed to a lawyer. It was addressed to anyone who believes silence equals absence, that a life can be erased if you don't speak it out loud. They were wrong. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to take more than I deserved. I just needed the truth entered into the record. If you're listening to this and you've ever been written out of a story that should have included, this, you don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to destroy to win. And you don't have to accept someone else's version of your life just because they wrote it first. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, prepare, and speak once clearly when it matters. Because justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a correction. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet battles in your own life, the ones where dignity mattered more than applause. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments or pass this story along to someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about restraint, accountability, and justice done right, consider subscribing and staying connected. Thank you for listening.